Dr. Nicole Bijlsma. It's wonderful to have you on. Before we begin, where are you today?
I'm based in Melbourne, Australia.
Oh my gosh, what time of the day is it?
It's currently just after 8 in the morning.
Oh, wow. I'm in New York City and it's 4 p.m. And as you can see out the window, it's already dark. So I've never been to Melbourne. I'm very curious to talk about your work in terms of the healthy environment that we live in and its unhealth and how that may be affecting us, because I know you've done quite a bit of work on that. Let's first start with this idea of the healthy home. Define healthy home for me.
That's a really great question because I spend so much time focusing on what an unhealthy home is. A healthy home is a dry home, for a start. A significant proportion of the work we do as building biologists is testing water damaged buildings. So it's very important to keep them dry. And that means, ideally trying to keep the humidity below 65% if you can, and above 40%. Cleaning up any water spills in a timely manner within hours, preferably. A healthy home doesn't have high levels of allergens. So allergen reservoirs include things like carpets and fabric curtains and things like that can really increase that load. Of course, because our dust, which is primarily skin cells and dander, and dirt accumulates over every year for the rest of the carpet's life. So it becomes the archaeological dig site of the entire house. You've got, your skin cells, you've got your pet dander, you've got your pollens, your fungal particulate like spores and hyphae, you've got all your chemicals, flame retardants, solvents, all your fragrances and cleaning products. They're all attached to those particles in the dust, which is often sitting on the floor, where of course most of the infants are crawling because it's so close to their breathing zone. So to me, there's a few things you definitely would do to maintain a healthy home, and probably the biggest one is maintenance. Lack of maintenance is a big issue that can result in significant health problems associated with mold and other things like this, and allergens. So maintaining your house, cleaning your gutters, taking your shoes off before you walk into the home is important to stop tracking those pesticides, which are ubiquitous in the environment, from coming to the home. Really thinking about the products you bring into your home. Like, we buy a lot of stuff that we don't need, personal care products, cleaning products to create a home. I think there's been a lot of misinformation about what a healthy home is, and that it needs, in the last 2 decades, that it's a sterile home, and that cannot be further from the truth. The healthiest homes we're seeing in places like the Amish communities, in third world countries, for example, in African communities, some parts of Russia, where the kids have virtually no allergies, very little autoimmune disorders, and they have a diversity of bacteria in the house microbiome. So biodiversity is the key to a healthy home, especially in the household dust. Bringing in a whole lot of chemicals to kill off bacteria, etc., is actually the worst thing we can do, because we know that having this biodiversity, especially in the first 2 years of life, of a child's life, where they have, a high hand-to-mouth ratio, they're ingesting a lot of that dirt, may have a protective effect and a positive immune response to reduce the incidence of asthma and allergies.
You've already confused me. So we want a range of biodiversity in our, I guess, what we put on our mouth as we're young, but we also want to keep things very clean. I need to square this. So in terms of like biodiversity, we're talking about it's okay to have like dirt on your vegetables and things like that so that we get that, but we don't want the things in the carpet that may be growing mold or things like that. Is that right?
Yes. So essentially, we want to keep our dirt, we don't want clutter. We don't want surface dirt that we can visually see. We want, good vacuum cleaners to reduce the allergen load in our carpets. So cleaning is important, and probably one of the most important will definitely be vacuuming if you've got asthma at least twice a week, to reduce the allergen load. So the way you handle the dust in the house will often establish, how healthy or not the house is. So we have a lot of everything is sitting in the dust essentially. So that becomes important. How you dust, how frequently you dust, what vacuum cleaner you use, etc., is very, very important.
I was going to ask you, what's your feeling on like air filters? Some people have, I live in New York, which is not known for its it's actually the air is pretty clean, but there's a lot of stuff around. So I have one of these HEPA air filters here. Is that useful?
Yes, absolutely it is. And the reason is because there are many sources of ambient or outdoor pollutants that come into the home when you open a window and open a door. The United Nations Environmental Program published a report that air pollution is one of the greatest risks from an environmental perspective to human health. We know traffic-related air pollution has multiple pollutants, particulates, noxious gases, etc., that of course can come into the home. If you live in a built-up area or city region, you're already at risk. So it's important to have air purifiers, and the most important component is the HEPA filter, high efficiency particulate air filter. And if you're living in more rural areas, bushfires are a very big risk, especially on the eastern states and in California, where they're subjected to bushfires pretty much every season. And it's like, when that happens, that smoke could be like smoking a packet of cigarettes a day. So it's important that your house is well sealed, that you have air purifiers to take on those particulates and trap that. Because if you don't get a filter, your body becomes that filter.
Yeah. I have the HEPA filter here that I discussed, but so there's sort of a central AC system. So I have one of these very minute particulate filters that I put on it. I got to tell you, Nicole, like I date the things and I take them out every 3 months and they're like chock full of stuff that, as you said, I would have been the filter and I would rather this thing have filtered that out.
Yes, it's the best insurance is to have a good vacuum cleaner with a high grade HEPA filter
Hmm.
and to have air purifiers and to reduce the load. Like I said, taking your shoes off, having
Hmm.
really good cleaning strategy is very, very important, and not bringing stuff into the home, like I mentioned, consumer products that could increase the pollutant load. So chemicals, fragrances, harsh cleaning products, all of those things is in order to keep a healthy home, I would say really good microfiber cloths, warm water, and a detergent that doesn't have fragrances in it will do most of the hard work in terms of the cleaning.
Oh, good to know. And I notice whenever you bring something into the home that's new, so, synthetic carpet or something, and you unroll it, it off gases. And I can't imagine that's such a great thing.
No, in fact, there's some interesting research in the veterinary world that cats with hyperthyroidism, so overactive thyroid illness, which is very common in cats, especially as they get older, could be attributed to the flame retardants in carpets. So the
Hmm.
vets, I've had a couple of my students who came into my course in the building biology course because their vet identified that their cat was sick because of the house and the carpets
Yeah.
and the flame retardants, and yet most doctors have no idea about this.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So let's talk about plastics. Microplastics seem to be having a moment in the culture. Talk to me about microplastics. Is this something, should I really be afraid? Are these inert? Are there different versions of this? How attentive should I be?
Yes, so there's different types of plastics. I think plastics is definitely a big problem in terms of global pollution. We know it's going up the food chain into fish, for example, and to birds that are eating the fish. It's a disaster, and that really came home to me when I went to Borneo recently with my son. And the amount of plastic bottles that are washing up onto those islands are horrific. And of course, as I said, they're building up, bioaccumulating up the food chain. I think we urgently need action to remove plastics from the environment, or at least restrict them significantly. And you see this when you go into African countries like Tanzania, for example, they're banned. So you don't see all these plastics like we do. They're convenient, but it's come at a very big cost. In terms of adverse health effects, Anna Soto and Carla Sonnenschein in the late 90s were looking at the impact of breast cancer. And what they were doing is, this is one of the first research to show that plastics were going to be an issue, is they got a whole lot of test tubes and put breast cancer cells in them. Then they added estrogen to half of them. And of course, they showed that breast cancer is an estrogen dependent cancer. What they didn't expect was that in the control test tubes where estrogen had not been added, the breast cancer cells multiplied. So they redid the study again and again, and the same results occurred. And what they ended up finding was the manufacturer changed the configuration of the plastic test tube And
Oh,
there was a chemical in there, nonylphenol, which is a hormone disrupting chemical typically found in things like polystyrene plastics that was causing the breast cancer cells to multiply. So we know there are plastics that are hormone disruptors, polystyrene, polyvinyl chloride, for example, bisphenols, also a big issue. And they are ubiquitous in those types of plastics, which are in our food packaging and our bottles and things like this. The fact that plastics take hundreds of years to break down, they might be recyclable, but when you look at the time frame, are they really? And so they're ending up in landfill. I think not about 91% of all recyclable plastics end up in landfill is the horrific stat that we think we're doing the right thing. Well, in reality, what's happening is quite different. So I think any way in which we can reduce our plastics is important. Another one is, of course, our clothing, and there's the plastics that are coming off into the grey water and into the stormwater system, of course, then building up the food chain. So I think the more we can go back to natural fibers and natural materials, the better it will be for all of us, because this is a global problem that is affecting all of us, and it's affecting our food. And of course, the whole issue of hormone disrupting chemicals, especially during critical windows of development, during pregnancy, in the first 2 years of life, are switching on genes that could have massive implications for that child's fertility down the track, and risk for things like breast cancers and other things like that.
well, let's talk about how these plastics may get into us. And let's sort of loop me back to healthy home. So, I mean, the most obvious one would be water. What are you thinking about water supplies and how people protect themselves from microplastics in water? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, water is an interesting one. I mean, people who are drinking bore water are at risk, especially when there's contaminants, and there's been a huge history of contaminated water in the US from flame retardants and other things like this, PFAS, etc. So it's important. Look, the most effective filter will be the reverse osmosis filter, and that will filter out most of your contaminants. But when it comes to hormone disrupting chemicals and pharmaceutical drugs, that's a different kettle of fish. So it's very difficult for reverse osmosis to remove many of the drugs that are found in the wastewater supply. So if you're drinking water that's recycled from effluent, which I know part of Britain there'll be, I don't know in the US how much of your drinking water is recycled from wastewater, but that would be a big red flag. Bore water needs to be tested regularly. I would strongly suggest that you must filter if you are drinking from aquifers and bore water, because you'll be at risk. But reverse osmosis is really the only filter that will help to reduce those plastics. Ironically, the latest biomonitoring studies in the US, the National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey, indicated that they're finding styrene in elevated levels in women of reproductive age in their latest findings. Styrene is a type of plastic, and it appears to be coming from a lot of the personal care products, some sunscreens, and women's products that they're putting on their skin. So there's another source that it's coming through their skin, is these products.
So you're saying in sunblock, some manufacturers put polystyrene in the sunblock? Is that right?
This styrene that's used, I'm just trying to think of the correct term, acrylate polymer that they're
Huh.
using in many personal care products. I believe it's a binder that they use. It's a very cheap ingredient that's used in many women's products. And if it's used in nano form, it can come through the skin. So there's a lot of issues about now nanoparticles in skincare that can, come through the skin into the systemic circulation. And that seems to be reflected by the biomonitoring studies that are being published in the US.
I'm wondering if this is because it's used as a binder, if maybe it's not necessary to put it on the packaging, that it's an ingredient.
Yeah, there's a lot. So yeah, exactly right. So there's some things like trade secrecy laws, for example, with perfumes would be my number one, in terms of personal care products. Try and remove anything that has fragrance in it, because they have trade secrecy laws. It could be hundreds of petrochemicals that make up that particular perfume. So that's the first thing I would say to a woman. If you're going to use personal care products, try and avoid artificial fragrances. You do need to read the label, and look, there's great organisations like the Environmental Working Group and Skin Deep that provide a list and a traffic light system for products that they recommend and those that they don't.
Yeah, EWG, Environmental Working Group, really excellent organization. I'm going to stay on this tack here. Cooking. It would seem to me, and I might be wrong about this, that if you have a skillet and say it's got something like Teflon or something like that on it, and then you've also got this plastic spatula. Everybody loves plastic spatulas because they clean really easy. But now you're applying heat to this and with your food. This sounds like a very bad idea. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, so with non-stick, ideally go with a ceramic lining is best, not, a non-stick surface, because of course, if there's any tear or any scratches in that, that's when it can be released into the food. Personally, I would prefer to go with just stainless steel and having to scrub off any baked on materials. Really go back to basics if you can, I think is the best case scenario. In terms of plastic spatulas, I mean, you're stirring the food, the contact time is minimal. I haven't seen data on a plastic spatula, moving food around. I tend to use wooden spoons, to be honest. But look, the plastics are incredible in terms of their convenience, but it seems to be coming at a cost, especially when it's building up our food chain and what's going on in terms of our waterways, etc. But yes, I think there are better alternatives, like your wooden spoons, like your stainless steel pots is better, because there's too much research to question about, is this a problem or not. To get to causation takes a lot in the research to say, yes, this causes that. That takes decades. It took environmental tobacco smoke decades. It took lead decades. It took asbestos decades. So whilst there's contention, I think everyone is best to go back to basics and, go with what we do know is safe, which is stainless steel pots, wooden spoons, as much as possible. And in terms of personal care products, women really need to be reading those labels and saying, is this safe enough? I would say, is this safe enough to eat? And I say that, not literally, in terms of putting on your skin, knowing that a lot of it could get into the systemic circulation.
I have some stainless steel, but I also have some the cast iron that are covered in this ceramic and the wooden spoons. My wife is like, oh, why the wooden spoon? But it just seems like that's a better idea.
Yes, I agree.
I know you've done research on EMF. What is EMF?
Right. So electromagnetic fields, a natural part of the, environment. We have the sun, its energy UV. We have the Schumann resonance that exists between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere, which is created from all the thunderstorms that are happening at any given moment on the planet. And it happens to be at a frequency similar to our own brain waves. So I don't think that's a coincidence in this biosphere. We have the Earth's magnetic field, DC field. So we have natural electromagnetic fields that we've evolved on that are an important part of having a biosphere that supports life. However, we've introduced man-made electromagnetic fields that, especially in the last 4 decades, that have increased 18 orders of magnitude compared to when our grandparents were children. And this was never really tested for its impact on human health. Essentially, what's become clear in the literature is that man-made electromagnetic fields are very different to natural electromagnetic fields, because you have this intense variability that doesn't enable the cell to recover. Essentially, we know what's happening at a biological effect. It suppresses melatonin. Blue light suppresses melatonin for a start. And of course, melatonin is one of the most important anti-cancer hormones we have, and has huge ramifications for almost every system of the body, not just the circadian system, but of course our reproductive system and our immune system. We also know that electromagnetic fields that are man-made from all your Wi-Fi enabled devices act on specific cells of voltage-gated calcium channels in the brain and in the heart and the testes, and they cause calcium influx, which can go one of 2 ways. When you have exposed to high levels of electromagnetic fields short term, like a lot with PEMF, for example, there's therapies coming out for electromagnetic fields. High levels at short term result in high oxidative stress, and the body responds by creating lots of enzymes, catalase, superoxide dismutase, which creates all these antioxidants to quench these free radicals. And if the antioxidants higher than the free radicals, it can result in bone healing effects, wound healing effects. So electromagnetic fields can actually have a positive response at high dose, but very, very short term, minutes, for example. When you have low grades electromagnetic fields, such as your Wi-Fi devices, your cell phones, your routers, extenders, boosters, cordless phones, mobile phone base stations, for example, when you're exposed to low levels, non-thermal effects, as in non-heating effects, over a long period of time, what it does is it gradually overwhelms the antioxidant pathways. So the cell starts to degrade, you get mitochondrial dysfunction, you could even kill the cell, you increase risk for cancers by causing DNA strand breaks over time. And this can take 5, 10, 15 years to have this gradual decline. And of course, there's a lot more data now to suggest that using a cell phone on one side of your head for half an hour or more per day for 10 years doubles your risk for certain types of brain tumors. So to me, one of the studies I published recently was the impact of a baby monitor on healthy adult sleep. And I chose a baby monitor because it emits some of the highest level of radio frequencies than any other consumer device, believe it or not. And what we see as building biologists is when a lot of the time when there are baby monitors in the nursery, that these children are not sleeping very well. So I said to my supervisor, I'd like to do research on it because anecdotally, we see a lot of kids that aren't sleeping well that have Wi-Fi enabled devices and baby monitors in their room. So I developed a 4-week study. First week was checking, baseline. So at the end of the 7 days, measuring the EEG, brain waves, measuring the heart rate variability, movement in bed, and also their sleep diary. In the second week, I put a baby monitor, which was double blind. So I didn't know if it was on or not. The digital display was not working and it was coded. So it was in the second and the fourth week, they would have had a baby monitor for 7 consecutive nights in their bedroom. And then I tested these adults to see at the end of the week what was going on with their brain waves and all of those other issues I mentioned. And in the third week was washout. So when they're exposed for a week to a baby monitor, there was then a week off because we have a histamine response with electromagnetic fields. So on the fourth week, the baby monitor went back into their bedroom for a whole week, and then we measured it. So essentially what we found was that it was statistically significant. 1/3 of the participants ended up with clinical insomnia within 7 nights of a baby monitor on their bedside table, which reflects real world scenarios because that's how the way baby monitors work, one on the bedside table, one in the baby's nursery. And it was, I thought it was going to be an issue, and that was validated with the study. The clinical sleep diary also indicated, we used the Pittsburgh Insomnia Rating Scale, and that was also significant. So we had both objective and subjective findings to indicate that a Wi-Fi enabled device, which in this case I used a baby monitor, impacted non-REM sleep after 7 nights. So yeah, it was interesting. I mean, as I said, anecdotally, I see this a lot with my clients when we're assessing their homes, but to actually see the data and see that it was statistically significant is very concerning.
So interesting. I don't sleep with a baby monitor, but
Do you have your cell phone in your bedroom or?
that's the next question. So I know tonight I would just power it off. There's like the power law, right? So the orders of magnitude depending on distance. So the further you have these things away from you, that seems better to me.
Yes, it's the inverse square law, and it's the only thing in science that actually is true. So I read a lot of misinformation on social media in relation to, plugins to reduce your electromagnetic fields, bring in scalar technology, all that sort of stuff that we can't prove or quantify when we're testing the home. So, but what we do know is the inverse square law. As you double the distance away from the source, you reduce your exposure by 75%. So the key there is making sure these devices are not in the bedroom or an adjacent room. In relation to devices that emit high levels of power outputs, like your extenders, your boosters, your routers, and cordless phones, you want to keep them well away from your bedrooms. For things like your smart meter and your routers, you want to power them down if you can. So they're only beaming electromagnetic fields in just parts of the house, not the entire house in the neighborhood.
So there are 800 units in the building that I live in. And if I go and I turn on my, available Wi-Fi network, so what do I do?
That's a really great question, and it's a quandary living in multi-story apartments where you're at the mercy of your neighbors because they will all have their own routers and it's almost like, this layered effect.
Yeah.
It's difficult. So you need to have hopefully a good genetic constitution to be able to cope with the onslaught of that stress that you cannot see, cannot smell. And this is a question building biologists are asking all the time,
Hmm.
living in built up areas. You can't get away from this. We can develop a Faraday cage and bring in
Oh my gosh.
shielding, but I'm really reluctant to do that because your body is aligned to the terrestrial radiation. We need to be exposed to the natural terrestrial radiation. And I think a big part of mental health issues could be attributed to the fact that we don't have a sense of place. We have no connection to the ground. Grounding is becoming a big thing. And I think it's important, to be grounded because as Aboriginals, we're very connected to our sense of place. We haven't, we have this beautiful balance, but we've completely lost this by living in mononuclear families, in multi-strata apartments. And I think that's coming at a cost to our mental health as well. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer to your question, David, in terms of your exposure to all the man-made electromagnetic fields immediately around you, short of creating a Faraday cage, which I don't think is the answer either.
I think the military have those. They're tents and they can go in there where electromagnetics, so they can't be surveilled. I don't think
Yes.
that seems a little extreme to me. But what I will do is I will just power my phone down because, as you said, the inverse square law, that's the closest thing. So just make some distance there. You mentioned the word grounding, which is another word that I hear quite a bit. And I actually have a grounding mat next to my bed and I plug it into the ground part of the electrical outlet. Is this at all useful or am I just not?
When I mean grounding, I mean literally going outside in the
Oh,
dirt,
I see.
ocean, talking people, because my focus is people with environmental sensitivities, chemical sensitivities, electromagnetic fields, allergens, all those sort of things. And what we find is when they go to the ocean, they're often a lot better. Because the
Right.
ocean's high in salts, it's an incredibly good grounding, natural grounding atmosphere. And of course, soil, that sort of stuff. When
Hmm.
it comes to grounding mats, I do find some of my clients with electromagnetic sensitivities are worse. And it appears because when you've got something that's grounded through the electrical system, you're actually attracting more of the irradiation towards you because it's got an easier path
It's
to
an
get
antenna.
grounded. Yes. And that's why we're very reluctant to use ground mats because we've
Okay.
found that you're actually more likely to attract it as it's grounded through your body and the mat and the electrical system. So I'm a bit two minds. Things like having an Epsom salt bath, if you're trying to reflect nature, an Epsom salt bath tends to be very helpful for people with sensitivities, especially to electromagnetic fields. But I'd
Why is
say
that? Why does that work?
I think it's the salt water in there, etc. I'm
Hmm.
not sure, but I'd imagine it's reflective more of what you would see in the ocean, for example. I'm sure there's science behind it. But that's what we're getting from people who are electrically sensitive is that salt baths are helpful for them, but especially going to the ocean and getting there, swimming, etc., can be quite profound in terms of them feeling normal again and forests and things like that. Connecting back to nature, this is the terrestrial radiation that we've evolved on.
Right. My recollection from the ocean is I think there's a lot of negative ions, I think.
Yes, negative ions as well, of course,
Yeah.
absolutely. With that, yeah, there's so much going on. We haven't really got an understanding of the true sense of the importance of the biosphere. It's so nuanced, and there's so many synergistic effects that are going on. I think we've been so busy trying to control nature in the last 100 years with science that we've completely got it wrong. Instead of going, wow, we're in this incredible biosphere. How do we understand it? How do we reflect it? And how do we support it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I don't have to understand it. All I have to do is be in it, and just remember to go into the forest, go swimming in the ocean, like expose myself to it, and because I know I just feel better.
Yes, exactly right.
Wow. Okay. I want to loop back to healthy home. We know that we don't want to bring toxins into our home. We know that we don't want to be spreading them onto our bodies. And if we don't know if we're doing that or not, we can go to places like Environmental Working Group and just obvious things like commercial detergents, the tide of the world, probably not a great idea. Are there other things that we need to be thinking about? I'm going to turn my phone off tonight and I will continue to do that. And I'll let you know because I wear a sleep monitor, which probably also has some EMF component to it. Oh, well, can't have everything. I'll measure my sleep and see if it's improved by moving the phone. Are there other things?
Yes, there are other things. And I'm just trying to think in terms of, well, there's so many other things. Well, mold is massive.
Mold,
I mean,
right.
that's a big part of the work that we do, and appears that there's a significant proportion, certainly in Australia, of the housing stock that are impacted by water damage that
Mm,
is could be contributing to people's illnesses. So when I'm looking at what's in the house that could be making people sick, I first I take an exposure history. So if they have asthma, allergies, hay fever, if they have recurrent colds and flu, that's persistent. So it's dragging on for weeks and months.
mm,
Most people, kids have colds and flus maybe 6 times a year. That's pretty normal. They get over it pretty quick. It's when it drags on for weeks and months that I
mm,
start thinking, is there actually water damage in their home? Things like
mm,
upper respiratory tract infections, chronic sinusitis, chronic bronchitis, pharyngitis, laryngitis, all the itises, which is inflammation, pneumonia, worst case scenario. Then I start thinking, is there mold in their car, in their workplace, and or in their home that could be contributing to that? The
mm,
other one is with electromagnetic fields. I'm looking at insomnia, sleep disturbances, headaches, tinnitus, ringing in the ears. They're common symptoms we're finding with people with electromagnetic sensitivity. So by taking a history, we're able to identify and pinpoint, which hazard could actually contribute to that particular problem. But the other one that's really big and it's not getting much attention is lead. Lead is still a very, very big problem in Western cultures because, in Australia, for example, we used, 200,000 tons of leaded petrol. I believe in the US it was about 6 million tons of leaded petrol that was used over many decades. And of course, lead does not break down. So it's sitting along the roadside, it's sitting in built
mm,
up areas. Last year, we had an interesting study that was published in Sydney that people who lived in Sydney within 30 kilometres of Sydney had elevated or detectable levels of lead in their soil. So having a vegetable patch or having could be an issue unless they've replaced that soil. They actually tested the eggs of backyard chooks in Sydney and found they had lead levels in some cases 40 times higher in the egg than the factory chook. And it was simply because they lived in a built up area where there was a lot of lead from
mm.
previous use of leaded petrol. So to me, lead
Wow.
is still a very big issue for neurodevelopmental disorders. I mean, we know autism has increased 4,000-fold since 1930, currently sitting at about 1 in 36 American children will be diagnosed with autistic spectral disorder. It is dramatically increased, especially in the last 4 decades. And there are various theories about that, but certainly toxic metals, aluminium comes up a lot with ASD. The latest systematic reviews is elevated levels of autism in these kids. Aluminium, and that can come from drinking water supply. It comes, unfortunately, from many of their vaccines are stabilized with aluminium. It used to be mercury, now it's aluminium. And of course, our cookware, aluminium, bakeware. I mean, aluminium's coming in a lot of different ways, unfortunately. So, and of course, electromagnetic fields, is some research, is that contributing? I think it's a synergistic effect of multiple toxins that are impacting Western children in the last 4 decades because our toxic load has just dramatically increased in 4 decades, as indicated by the biomonitoring studies. So we desperately need to reduce our toxic load, especially in our food. A lot of it's coming from our food that's contaminated, that's processed. Look at your colors and flavors and artificial. Our salt is full of aluminium, like, as a free-flowing agent. So we need to look at our food. We need to go back to seasonal, local, organic, and whole. We need to cook things from scratch, and try and reduce our processed food as much as possible. Thinking about where your fish is sourced, because a lot of it could be contaminated with mercury, for example. Our farm fish fed, Fish can also be a big problem because they're fed with grains, etc. And then there's no longer any omega-3, but there's other crap in there. So it's just a nightmare. It's completely overwhelming for many families trying to do the right thing. So for me, I would say go back to scratch. You know, go organic food as a minimum, I think is important. Pesticides are frequently associated again with neurodevelopmental disorders, autism and ADHD, as well as Parkinson's and dementia. So with my PhD, I looked at the impact of environmental chemicals on human health, and pretty much every chronic disease you can think of, there are environmental chemicals that are correlating or associated with them. So reduce that toxic load as much as possible. Start with your food. I know that's very overwhelming for people to hear, but there, the good news is there's a lot of things you can do to reduce that.
Right. And, the way that I like to look at these things is deal with the worst stuff first. So wherever you are, stop with the processed food first.
Yes.
And worry about the EMF stuff later. You sort of work yourself down the chain of the worst stuff first. So,
yeah. So let's leave with some good news, which is
please.
start with your food. Try to make everything from scratch where you can. I know it's difficult. I've got 3 kids, and I've got my own college that I run and etc. But start with your food if you can. Know where your food comes from. Know your butcher. Know your greengrocer so you know where it's coming from. Fresh food is important. It gives you the resilience to deal with the environmental onslaughts. Don't have pesticides in the home. That is my big one. Garden chemicals and pesticides are very, very toxic and often associated with many of the chronic diseases that we see in Western cultures. Take your shoes off before you get into the house. Make sure, if you've got people with asthma and allergies or chronic respiratory problems, I think carpets need to go. And if you can get, natural hardwood surfaces would be better, or tiled surfaces if you're in hot, humid environments would be a better option, easier to clean. Try and reduce the amount of chemicals cleaning the home. Don't use bleach, don't use ammonia. Use good detergent that's preferably fragrance-free, really good microfiber cloths, a good vacuum cleaner that will do 90% of all of your cleaning. If you have a water event, dry it as fast as possible, preferably within 24 hours so it doesn't become a mold problem. If you have a mold issue or, have chronic fatigue-like symptoms, you probably need to get someone in to test the house to see if mold is actually an issue, or a building biologist to identify EMFs. And with electromagnetic fields, just don't have it in the room. Anything that's Wi-Fi enabled, printers, mice, your mouse, computer mouse, your phone, routers, extenders, boosters, not in the bedroom, and preferably not an adjacent room to the bedroom. Put it in the living space for 2 weeks and see how you go. Does it actually improve your sleep? That's what I would say to most people. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very useful tips. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. I think that this is, increasingly complex, dealing with all this stuff that 100 years ago wasn't an issue. But as I said, I live in Manhattan, so I'm just in the vortex of this sort of thing.
Yes, so this is why air purifiers become really important, and being informed. Knowledge is power. Critically thinking is important because there is a lot of misinformation out there. So, always get second and third opinions. I think naturopaths and integrative doctors are a good people to go to help you navigate a lot of this as well. But I'm looking forward to launching a healthy home course next year in the US to help people become healthy home advisors.
Very useful. It's complex. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us from Australia today, from Melbourne. It's been lovely to chat, and thank you for keeping the home healthy.
Thank you so much, David.
Take care now. Bye-bye.